Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to INSS English Podcast. I'm Adi Kantor. On the morning of October 7th, Israel faced the most tragic and monstrous attack, which atrocious dimensions had not been seen nor imagined in its then 70 years of existence. This attack was the deadliest atrocity against Jews since the Holocaust. The massacre of Israeli civilians in the Gaza-border communities by Hamas and the subsequent Israeli-Hamas war resulted in an unprecedented increase in Jew hatred worldwide. Alone from October to December 2023, the number of reported incidents rose by 500% in the UK, 400% in Germany, 813% in the Netherlands, and 430% in the United States. Anti-Semitic chants against Jews, of course, were loudly heard in campuses in the West, across Europe and the US, in formerly known as distinguished academic institutions, whose leading professors truly believe that calling for the genocide of Jews does not necessarily count as anti-Semitic or dehumanization, but they are rather counted as context-dependent decisions. Anti-Semitism is everywhere to be seen, from the far left and pro-Palestinian protesters to Islamic fundamentalism, all the way to the far right, with its clear strengthening after October 7th. But as we know, this phenomenon is no longer on the margins of society, but in the center of social political discourse. College professors, teachers in schools and kindergartens, policemen, judges, and physicians have, in the less worse scenario, no clue what anti-Semitism is or how to fight it, and on the worst case, hold themselves anti-Semitic positions and are spreading them in their circles. What are the tools to assess global anti-Semitism after October 7th, and what are the efficient ways to combat it? Who stands behind the mass anti-Israeli demonstrations around campuses in the US, in Europe? What is the relation to Qatari money, and how can one explain the relations also between academia and anti-Semitism? To answer these questions in depth, with me in the INSS studio today is Dr. Charles Asher-Small, the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, ISGAP. He's the author of a 5-volume book entitled Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity, published by ISGAP Publications and Brill Press. He's currently the director of the Fellowship Training Program on Contemporary Critical Anti-Semitism Studies at the Woolf Institute, Cambridge University, and a research fellow at the St. Edmund's College, Cambridge University, and senior research scholar at the Dayan Center for Middle East and African Studies. Charles Small, thank you so much for joining me in this talk today.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. Charles, let us begin this talk more with a personal question. October 7th, and then as director of ISGAP, how did it influence you and your work since then? Combating anti-Semitism. What were the new challenges that you were faced with as director of the Institute?
Great question. I don't know if I have an easy answer, but look, it was a shock, maybe not a surprise, but a shock. It really reverberated around the world, certainly around the Jewish world, Israel, and the diaspora. As you know, it was one of the most horrific acts of violence carried out by Jews against Jews since the Holocaust. I think after October the 7th, the Jewish communities, particularly the United States, realized that we're at a different moment. I think until October the 7th, the American Jewish community thought that anti-Semitism was a thing for perhaps the Middle East, for Europe, for the United Kingdom, increasingly in Canada and South America, but people thought not here, that the United States was somehow different. And I think the massacre of October the 7th and then the reaction in the United States by so-called intellectuals and students and some political leaders was a wake-up call for the American Jewish community. And I think, in a way, I'm pleased to see there's, some young, resilient people, stepping up to the challenge. So I think Jewish organizations in the United States and around the world, and also the government of Israel, need to rise to the challenge. And I see that some institutions and some individuals are really taking the lead, which is wonderful.
Before we dive into trying to explain what is happening in the campuses and the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, let us first talk about the relations between academia and anti-Semitism. two worlds that should never have met. But reality shows us that there are relations and direct correlations between the two. How does one explain this? We would expect academics or professors from distinguished, as I mentioned in my introduction, distinguished universities that they would know what anti-Semitism is when they meet it, and not say that this is a matter of calling for the genocide of Jews is only a question of context. How do you explain it? How do you explain this very strange relation?
So I don't know if there's an easy answer, but I'll start by saying, when I started studying, I went to McGill University as an undergrad, and I was really raised to think that education was a place, or universities were a place where you were seeking truth and wisdom and knowledge. And it was a place where, there was a free flowing of ideas and debate and discussion and study and rigorous thought. But I think we have a blind spot when it comes to anti-Semitism. I think unlike the study of racism and gendered inequality in Western civilization, which I think in the last 5, 6, 7 decades there's been progress on these issues, academia deals with it. We have a language, we have an understanding of how race and racism and sex and sexism is rooted in our language, in our cities, in our economic spheres, etc., political spaces as well. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, there really isn't that body of knowledge. And I think if we take a step back with our assumptions here in this conversation, why would we think that universities are not anti-Semitic? Because, you're a scholar of German society. We know that leading up to the Holocaust, leading up to the reign of Nazism in Germany and in Europe, that the intellectual foundations came out of the universities. The science, the eugenics, the theology which said that white people were superior to African people, the notion that Jews were a race that was poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. It came out of universities.
Yeah, and we're still surprised.
And yet,
80 years after.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's this legacy in Western civilization of really horrible anti-Semitism that is deeply rooted in our thought, in our theology, in our social sciences, and even in our sciences. So what happened, in a way, is a new variation of this old hatred, and the fact that universities have played, and intellectuals have played a leading role in, fomenting Jew hatred. So at one level, we shouldn't be shocked. We should really understand how anti-Semitism is deeply rooted in Western civilization.
One of the main projects of ISGAP is, of course, Follow the Money. I'd like to hear more about the project. What have you discovered, especially since October 7th, about this relation between foreign money that is being transmitted to the universities and the demonstrations that we've witnessed in the past 9 months? What is the correlation there?
So there's a strong correlation. Since October the 7th, ISGAP, the research center that I direct, came out with 11 reports since October the 7th on Qatari funding of mainly American universities. So in one report, we lay out that we through our assessment, we believe that the Qataris have $1 trillion in assets that they're using for soft power. We have to remember that the Qatari regime is connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. They have a bay'ah, they have a spiritual oath to the Brotherhood. They follow the edicts, the fatwas, and the religious rulings of the Brotherhood. And we know the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood for many years, Yosef Qaradawi, always preached that the true believer, the true Muslim, is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. So here's a regime that represents this ideology, and we have to remember that the anti-Semitism, the Jew hatred, the demonization of Jewish people in the state of Israel is not the rantings and ravings of the extreme element of the Muslim Brotherhood or the radical element. This is a core, philosophical, ideological underpinning of the whole movement. And that the Muslim Brotherhood really comes out of an amalgamation of European anti-Semitism, the protocols of the Elders of Zion. The same words and ideas that led to the Holocaust is a foundational element of the Muslim Brotherhood worldview. There's also, influences of Nazism and fascism with a combination of what I would call a perversion of Islam. And the social movement has been marching forward for 100 years in the Sunni world and also in the Shiite world. Even despite the Sunni-Shiite divide, the Iranian revolutionary regime pays homage to its Sunni Muslim Brotherhood intellectual giants. So this is deeply rooted. We also found, and this is a country, Qatar is a country of less than 350,000 citizens. Qatar, with its Muslim Brotherhood ideology, is giving more money to American universities than any other country on the planet. So here's a tiny country, 350,000 citizens or less, giving more money than China, than Russia, than all of the European countries, Canada, the United Kingdom.
By the way, why particularly the U.S.? Why do they want? Yeah,
it's not just the U.S. This has been the focus of our research. We're expanding our research to Canada and to Europe, and they're very active in Europe as well. And it's basically the use of soft power. They're using soft power. The stated objective of the Muslim Brotherhood is to move Israel away from the United States and the West, to isolate it, to destroy it, and to use anti-Semitism to fragment and weaken and destroy the United States. So to destroy the little Satan first, and then the big Satan. And this is happening right under our noses for the past 40 years with great success. So we've underestimated our enemies. And we know through our research that the Qatari regime is giving at least tens of billions. We estimate close to $100 billion to American universities that we understand. This is from foreign funding, but the Qataris are also buying American corporations, banks, real estate, and those entities are also giving money to the universities, and that's much more difficult to track.
Sure. Unbelievable. Can you tell us a bit more about the student bodies standing behind those demonstrations? We're talking about far left together with pro-Palestinian fundamentalists, Muslim fundamentalists who are marching there. Who are these students marching there?
I think we have groups like SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, which is also an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. On October the 9th, the SJP in the United States said that they weren't just supporting the Palestinians, they weren't just supporting the people in Gaza, they weren't just supporting Hamas, they said, we are Hamas. We are the struggle. So here's a group of students supporting a designated terror organization in the United States of America. And the SJP also has connections to the Muslim Brotherhood. They come out of the AMP, the American Muslims for Palestine, which is definitely connected to the Muslim Brotherhood as well as extreme left-wing organizations. We published a report on SJP in March. It's our second major report, and I think we show these financial and ideological connections. So there's that. They're kind of the thugs on campus, and they've been tolerated for 20 years or so on more than 400 American campuses. But I think what's also important to note is that there are professors, there's intellectuals in the classrooms of elite universities preaching the same ideology in the classroom and informing the student discourse. Rashid Khalidi, former PLO Minister of Information, a professor at Columbia University, recently retired, and at his retirement party, professors and students were praising him for playing a key role in creating the student movement at Columbia and throughout the United States. So So this is it's happening at the intellectual, ideological, philosophical level and at the political level. So from the classroom to the encampments, from the encampments onto the streets, into the subways, into the attacking Jewish communities, synagogues, restaurants. So yes.
Do you see any different? You say, of course, that this is happening across the U.S. and Europe, and of course, we'll talk about also South Africa in a bit. Do you see any differences between U.S. and Europe with regards to campuses? Do we see different discourse, or the discourse is the same in all of them?
From what I would say, it's similar, but I would say that the wave of anti-Semitism started in Europe probably about 25, 30 years ago and kind of swept Europe through Canada into the United States. Mm-hmm. Look, we have to remember, I think it was 1983, Edward Said said that he was the last Jewish intellectual, that he was the inheritor to the Frankfurt School of Thought, that Jewish scholars in the United States became fat scribes in the suburbs of America, and that the Palestinians were the Jews and the Israelis were the Nazis. When he said this in 1983, people thought he had a bad day or he was detached from reality. But this is the discourse today at our finest university. So in 40 years, this is the discourse. If Israel is a Nazi, apartheid, fascist, occupying, genocidal entity, from a liberal human rights perspective, and certainly from an Islamist perspective, this entity has to be dismantled. So this is what the goal of this kind of intellectual and philosophical movement is. In November of 2023, about a month after the October 7th pogrom, I was at Columbia University for a teach-in. And at this teach-in, there were professors and doctoral students speaking about the occupation. And there were professors of gender studies, feminists, arguing...
Known phenomenon.
Yeah, but they were arguing, they were, scholars at one of the best universities in the world. And they were arguing that, Israel is an occupying entity, and what happened with Hamas on October the 7th was an act of resistance, and that the resistance is justified morally, ethically, and they're using philosophy.
Jewish feminists.
And these weren't Jewish, but there were Jewish feminists.
Among them were also...
Yeah. So they were arguing philosophically, with ethics, with post-colonial thought, with literature. These are master intellectuals. Yeah. And they were saying that this is a form of resistance and that the murder was justified, and even the sexual brutality carried out against Jewish Israeli women were justified. And those to blame for the violence were the Jews because they were on the land. So this is not only an intellectual call for the elimination of the state of Israel by so-called progressive people, this is also a call for the murder of Jewish people around the world at the most high level of philosophical thought.
Unbelievable. So
this is, and I think we're at a tipping point philosophically, and the Qataris and the Muslim Brotherhood knows, and we know this from history, universities are the most sensitive institution in our democratic society. It's where young people go to learn to be citizens. And for 2 generations, we've tolerated this, and for 2 generations, this is the intellectual discourse that young citizens are receiving. And this is, future journalists, future professors, future captains of industry are being inculcated in this legitimizing form of Jew hatred and the demonization of Israel. And yes, and we have not shown up to the battlefield of ideas. We're not there. And I think we need to be at the battlefield of ideas. We have to be at the kinetic battlefield, but we have to be at the intellectual battlefield as well.
I think to call it a battlefield of ideas is precisely how it should be called, and this is exactly where, unfortunately, we are at. Now discussing how to combat this. Is there somehow a way to fight this this hate around Jews, against Jews around the world? What are the tools? Where do we begin? Who are the partners?
There's definitely a way. The Jewish people have been always innovative and creative, and we always find ways to survive and to, confront the challenges. But these are, definitely serious challenges. I would say that the Israeli establishment, at the political level, at the security level, at the academic level, need to understand that anti-Semitism is not just a problem for the shtetl Jews in Galut. And for too long, Israeli people thought that they've left the world, and we have Zionism is about the self-determination and taking Jewish destiny into our hands, which is wonderful.
They thought that has nothing to do with them.
Right, but this is a dire strategic threat to the state of Israel. And it's also obviously a significant threat to diaspora Jews throughout the world. So we need Jewish leaders in the diaspora, I think, to take innovative, creative methods of fighting this new explosion of anti-Semitism. David Harris, my colleague at ISGAP, who ran the American Jewish Committee for decades, is arguing that we need new institutions, that that the old institutions are almost like an aircraft carrier, that it's very difficult and takes a long time to turn around. And when you start to, by the time you turn around, your enemies have, flown by you. Mm-hmm. We need, small, agile, effective organizations in the diaspora. And I think Israelis need to really connect with people in the diaspora to understand the strategic importance of what's taking place in terms of how anti-Semitism is empowering the enemies of democracy and empowering the enemies of Israel on the radical left, on the radical right, and certainly political Islam.
Sure, clear. Maybe a last question regarding, you mentioned, fighting anti-Semitism has a lot to do with, first of all, understanding what anti-Semitism is, the whole question of definition. And I'm not sure even, there are not so few Jews and Israelis who don't even know how to define the problem before they even began to tackle the problem. So it has to do with education, of course. After October 7th, there has been a major difficulty to educate on Holocaust because it came from pupils, from students, that, the comparisons between Holocaust and what happened on that horrible Saturday. How do you think, educational-wise, how do you think it should be dealt with in the school by the teachers? Because this is where the challenge begins. Explaining to students first of all the differences.
I think tragically, Holocaust education has obviously failed because of the situation that we're in. Yeah. I think it's important for Jewish people, especially in the United States, where the levels of assimilation and disconnection is so huge. One of our projects that we're doing is a project called Jewish Consciousness, going back to Jewish texts, going back to Jewish concepts of who we are, what our sense of justice is, what our sense of how we, perceive ourselves and treat the other. The ethics, the wisdom is incredible. And key to this is that, our enemies are defining us. Right. Now in the United States, so-called intellectuals and progressive people are saying that Jews are white. And then white and privileged. And then some of the responses is, well, we have Mizrahi Jews and Ethiopian Jews. We're not all white. From a Jewish perspective, there's no such thing as race. We're a nation. We're a people. And I think we need to get in touch with these kind of concepts to empower ourselves. And we also have to remember the so-called, in the American racist prism, the so-called white Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, they were the victims of one of the most horrific forms of racist brutality in human history. And now these clowns are, defining Jews as white, and Jews are feeling a little bit, ambiguous about their identity and their privilege. I think we have to really educate ourselves, and if we know who we are and what we are, then we can come up with strong responses.
Face the world.
Yeah.
Clearly, what you are pointing at is really alarming. The situation in campuses across the U.S. Would you like to give us more specific examples?
So I can give you two quick examples of Qatari interference in American higher education. One of the reports we did was on Texas A&M. Texas A&M has a campus in Qatar, in Doha, an education city, and we found a contract that Texas A&M had with the Qatari Foundation. We found 502 research projects. Of the 502 research projects, 58 we've determined to be dual use for military purposes, 13 for dual use nuclear purposes. And the contract was for $1.3 billion. And in this contract, Texas A&M gave all the intellectual property rights to this research to the Qataris, which is very unusual. Wow. And in another case we found with Cornell University, we found that the Qataris gave Cornell $1.95 billion with a B dollars plus $8 billion in infrastructure to create a medical school and hospital in Qatar, which is part of the Cornell Medical School. And all this money is not being, reported to the American government as required by law.
Dr. Charles Small, thank you so much for joining me in this alarming talk, very important talk. Let us hope for better days. Thank you so much for our audience also as well, and see you in the next program.